Hey everyone, Jeremy Gerard from Mythic Customs here with one of my short customizing tutorials. Today's video, we're going to talk about a question I hear lots of new customizers ask, and that's how do you deal with an action figure's joints when you're doing a repaint, when you're customizing that figure? Specifically, how do you deal with paint rub, right? There's a couple different ways that you can treat joints when you're doing custom Mythic Legions action figures, and I want to talk about them in this video. Ultimately, there's 4 ways that we're going to look at. The first way, and it's what I generally prefer, is don't paint them at all. And now that may sound kind of flippant to say like, oh, just don't address them, don't paint the joints. But the reality is that is my first approach. That is my preferred approach. My good friend and fellow customizer, Nikki Nicole Cheney, if you ask her this question, she's going to say the same thing, that she looks for recipes that don't require joints be painted. And that is my go-to as well. So my first option, my first suggestion is try to come up with recipes where you don't have to paint the joints. Let me show you a couple examples of, customs I've done that fall under this category. So the first one here is kind of my Vampire Knight character. Now this is mostly just a simple pop and swap custom. This uses pieces from the Celtis figure, so that purple armor is from the Celtis figure, but I wanted to mix both purple and black, because if you know the Celtis figure, it's got the purple armor, but for the upper arms and the upper legs, those limb pieces, it's got the bones, the blue bones that Celtis comes with. I wanted to make this not a skeleton. I wanted to make this a full armored character, and I wanted black armor. Now I easily could have gotten some armor and painted it black, but in this particular case, I used pieces from the Black Knight Legion builder because those pieces already came in the color I wanted. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying if you can come up with a recipe, if you can find parts that are already available in the colors that you want, that is the best way to treat paint rub and to treat joints because you're not actually treating them at all. Let's look at another example here. So these are 2 different genie characters that I created. The genie was one of the first customs that I ever did for Mythic Legions, and it used a Zazar body. I wanted it to be a blue skin genie. So the fact that there already was a blue skin body in Zazar was a perfect starting point for me. Now, in this particular case, I've swapped out some of his armor. I've painted it gold. I've given him new feet and a new head. Those are both parts that I worked on with Walter DeMarco of Mass Customs and were sold through Wolf King Customs. But putting those pieces on that blue base body totally allowed me to have the kind of character that I wanted without having to paint the joints. Now on the other side here, we got a red skin genie type character. Years ago, before the Fury Clan Orc was available, I actually did a full body repaint on a figure to do a red skin genie. But once the Fury Clan Orc became available and I wanted to do additional red skin genie type characters, that proved to be a perfect base body because once again, it already had the colors I wanted. So think of that when you're actually considering your designs. Think about which base bodies you're going to use and, look around the different Mythic Legions bodies and fodder pieces to see if you may be able to find a part that's the color you want or very close to it. Share something else here, and then we will, I promise you, go on and talk about a couple different ways you can treat these. So this is the last example I'm going to talk about when it comes to using base bodies. And I show these 2 here because I wanted to show how if you think creatively, you can use base bodies in lots of different ways. So one of my favorite base bodies to use is the Taurian, the black-skinned Minotaur. The black color is really, really easy to match if you're painting other pieces to go with it because Black is one of the easiest colors to match because there's not a lot of different shades or anything. Really great starting point to use. So that Taurian body is one that I've used many, many times. You can see the figure on the left here is my Black Panther type custom. That is literally a Taurian body with some armor parts swapped out, and it's one of the Jagularian heads. That was probably from a Panther or a Purplor figure, I should say, repainted black along with the tail to match this body here. Now, on the other side, on the right side, you can see this demon-like character that I created that once again uses a lot of different parts. It uses a lower skirt from a WWE Undertaker figure. It uses a head that was at once Kratos from the God of War game that I repainted it, and some horns to make it look like a unique demon-type character. But two very, very different looks off that same all black skin based body. So you can do a lot of cool things just by using those bodies in creative ways. Okay, now the next way that you can treat the bodies, because let's be honest, the one that I just said where I was like, don't treat them at all, find recipes that don't deal with the joints. I get it. That's kind of a cop-out. You can't always do that. There are some cases where you cannot find a body readily that meets your needs, and you're going to have to do some paint work. So the next few are going to be some options. One of them you can do is you can actually shave down the joints. Now, if you look at the way these joints work, and I do the elbow here, that's, a common one that you're going to paint the lower arms on the figure. What happens is the way the joints actually move, the joint itself, if you paint over it, it's going to increase the thickness. And what happens is there's not enough clearance between the joint, and that's what ends up rubbing. Okay. Very, very common for that to happen. So what some people will do, and full disclosure, I've never actually done this. This is a level of effort that even I've never wanted to do. I've never had to actually do it. But what they will do is they will shave down that joint to get more clearance. So then you can paint on top of it and still have enough clearance that the paint won't rub. It is definitely a higher level of customization if you want to do this. But if you want to take the time, this is certainly an option you can consider. One caution I will give you is, depending on the joints you're shaving down, there's not a lot of plastic there in the first place. So if you're not careful, you could actually dig too deep in to the plastic of the joint, and you could severely degrade the integrity of that joint itself. Mythic Legions figures typically don't have floppy joints, especially a lot of the newer figures. They're nice and they're solid, but if you dig too deep into there with like a Dremel or even like a tiny little nail file, you will potentially degrade that. So if you are going to try to shave down that plastic to give yourself more clearance so then you can paint, just be very, very careful you don't destroy the figure. The level of difficulty is higher. The room for mistakes is lower. The third way you can do it is actually dye the parts. Again, this is something I haven't personally done, but I know a lot of customizers have done this as well. I have dyed figures in the past. I've never dyed a Mythic Legions figure. It is definitely a messy avenue to go down. How to dye figures is kind of outside of the scope of this particular video. Again, there are some videos out there of people doing it. I know some of my fellow Mythic Legions customizers have done this, but it is an option. You do have to keep the heat at a certain level. You can't dye every single color, so it's not going to be perfect. What a lot of people do is they either tend to dye the parts black, so at least if there's paint rub, the joints underneath it are black, and that's at least preferable to some weird color that doesn't match the the figure you're creating at all. If you have to have a default color, black's a good one to do. Other people will try to dye it close to the color they're actually going for. Because remember, dye works differently than paint. Paint sits on top of the surface. Dye soaks into the plastic itself, changing the actual color of it. So this whole idea of paint rub, not having enough clearance, that goes away if you're actually dyeing the part, because it doesn't theoretically change the actual shape or anything of the part that is going to be moving, of that joint part. So you can certainly consider dyeing. Again, some people will dye black, some people will dye a color close to what they want to paint and then paint over it. That way, if there is a little bit of rub, the color that shines through is at least close to what they were going for anyway. The last option is to simply paint the joint and accept there might be some paint rub there. That is certainly an option. And in instances where I cannot find a base body that is the color I want, again, I don't Dremel, I down the joints, and I don't dye. So this is my other option. If I can't find what I'm looking for, I will paint the joints. Some tricks that I have found similar to the dyeing, if I'm going to base everything out, I usually base everything out in black paint. So I've showed this before, but this Krylon Color Max black paint, this is my go-to paint for base bodies, for basing things out in black. I don't use primer per se, but if I want everything to start with a consistent color, because right, if you're using disparate parts, if you're using parts from 3D part providers that come in different color resins, starting everything with that same base color is necessary. So that's the black I use. Now, if I use a light coat of that black, usually that's enough that the joints, I won't see paint rub with just that nice light spray paint coat. Then if I paint over it and I get even a little bit of rub, the black is what leaks through. So similar to what I was telling you about with the dyeing black, this is kind of my workaround for it without all the craziness and messiness of having to dye figures. That's what I do. But then I do paint over it. I do try to do a light coat whenever possible to avoid some paint rub. But the reality is these are custom figures. I'm not playing with them. I'm not posing them very much. So I accept that sometimes there may be paint rub, but I also try, once I'm done painting them, to pose them the way I want, to put them on display and not move them. So that's another way that I won't maybe get a lot of paint rub. Let me show you a few examples of some figures that I actually have painted the joints. So here's two different customs, and the orc on the left, that is my orc cleric. That body actually started out as a Chronaw. So Chronaw is a bluish body, and what I did here was I painted the chest and that left arm and the head all to be that green color, but I based it out because I wanted them all to be the same color to begin with, right? The head was a resin print, so it was one color. The torso and the arm were, blue from Chronaw. So I based them all out in a nice light layer of black. Then when I laid that green color over it, if I do get any paint rub just right in that little elbow area there, it doesn't look wildly out of place. On the right-hand side, we have my tribute to the Star Wars bounty hunter character IG-88. I created him to be kind of, an Iron Golem. In my head, IG stood for Iron Golem, and that's what I imagine that character to be. Now, the very nature of this character is he's like an old kind of, rusty, he's got some oxidation on him. He's an automaton. He's like a robot character, something created by a crazy wizard type character, I guess. The very nature of that figure being kind of dirty and kind of worn out makes it so if there is a little bit of paint rub, it doesn't totally look out of place. So that's another thing that I'll offer to you. When you think about your recipes, think about what you're creating. If you're creating something that some wear and tear is not going to look totally out of place anyway, then even if there is a little bit of paint rub, it doesn't ruin the custom figure. You can still maintain the overall look that you are going for. But in both of these cases, I guarantee you that if I move those arms around too much, if I move those legs around too much, I will get a little bit of paint rub. But because of the way I've treated either the base color or the recipe itself and what I was going for, it's not going to look out of place. One more example to show you here. So these are some gargoyle figures that I created recently, and all of these follow that same example I was just telling you, where these are lots of disparate pieces on all of these. I based every one of these out in black before I painted over them. Now, the paint job on these is super straightforward and super simple. It's just some dry brushing of some grays on top of that black to get that stone-like look that I'm going for. But again, because I have that base of black, the joints aren't going to look out of place if there's a tiny bit of rub, because these are so spotty in terms of the coloring anyway. Because of that stone effect, there is some black shining through and bleeding kind of through the paint job a little bit. So because of that effect, these gargoyles do not look totally out of place. Even if their joints, you see a little bit of that black underneath it, it still absolutely works. So those are my suggestions when you are thinking about joints. You can either do what I do, which is really work to find recipes where you don't have to paint the joints in the first place, even if that means taking an idea and putting it aside for a little while until the base body that you know is going to allow you to do that, to use that base body as is, or those base parts as is. I do that all the time where I have an idea in the piece that I want, I don't have in yet. Maybe it's something that's on pre-order. I put that aside, I come back to it later. So don't paint the joints at all because you're using parts that already have the colors you want. That's number one. The other thing I do, again, is just base out those parts in black or paint them and accept that there may be a little bit of paint rub, but come up once again with recipes where that's not going to destroy the figure itself. The other two options, if you want to kick it up to a higher level of complexity and difficulty, is either shave down those joints with like a little file or a Dremel. Be careful with a Dremel, especially because the power tool, and you don't want to gouge into those and destroy the integrity of the joints. Or consider dyeing the parts themselves, either a black color as a base or a color close to what you're going for anyway. Say you're painting an orc body and you're starting with a not orc color green. You can try to get that to be dyed a kind of green, and then on top of that, you can paint so at least green bleeds through. Dyeing's complicated because you can't dye every color on top of every color, so that's a whole thing as well. And once again, it's a little bit outside of the scope of this video, other than to say dyeing is an option. Hopefully this helped answer your questions about ways that you can treat joints when you are customizing Mythic Legions. Trust me, I've done hundreds of Mythic Legions customs in the past. So if you think the idea of trying to avoid painting joints is a cop-out and you can't use that to make lots of customs, I would tell you you are incorrect, because I've made tons of them using exactly that approach. If you enjoy videos like this, please give it a like. If you have any comments, hit me up in the comments section. I always love to see those comments so I can respond to them and have a conversation. Certainly, if you're not already subscribed to the channel yet, please consider doing so to help raise awareness of these tutorials that I try to create here. Until next time, I can't wait to see what you make.